Is this glass half empty or half full? This classic question reveals something very important about how rhetoric and persuasion work. Many things that we witness in our lives can be described in many different ways, and in sometimes contradictory ways. But the way that we describe that situation or that thing matters in terms of how an audience or other people might think about that thing and act in relationship towards that thing. And so if we say that the glass is half full, that encourages more of an optimistic feeling towards the glass. If we say that it's half empty, that's a little bit more of a pessimistic view of what's going on. And so the words that we use to describe something matter in how we'll think about it. And that is what this lesson is all about, asking two questions. How does rhetoric shape how we think about things? And second, knowing that, how can we analyze rhetoric and persuasive acts in order to determine how that rhetoric is encouraging us to think and act about a particular issue? So we'll start this lesson by having a quick definition of what frames are, explain how those frames shape how we might think and act, and then work through a process of analyzing them. Let's start with a basic definition. A frame is how a rhetor or a speaker describes and packages an issue or situation for their audience. And I think it would be helpful to think of someone who's trying to take a picture of a mountain. No matter what happens, the mountain is going to be the same. But that picture will look a lot different based off of where the person is taking the picture from, their vantage point, what time of day that they are taking the picture, which side of the mountain are they on? Are they actually on the mountain or are they away from the mountain? Do they zoom in on something or not? Do they show the clouds? So even though the mountain stays the same, how someone would think about the mountain would be different based off of where the image is shot and how. The same is true for language in terms of how we are describing issues or events. What details do we include? Are we talking about this issue at a local level or a national level? Do we only focus on the benefits or only focus on the downsides? And so those questions show us that our descriptions of situations will influence how the audience is interpreting, processing the information about the event, and thus how they are thinking about that event. But let's turn to a quick example of how this might work. Here's our first example. Take a moment to figure out what you see in that image. You could even pause the video for a second and just kind of jot down, what do you see when you look at that image? And so if you're seeing the bunny, this is the eye, and then these are the ears. And the bunny is looking off to the right. But if you are seeing the duck, the eye is the same, the ears become the beak, and then it's looking off to the left. And so that example gets us to a basic point about frames and how they work. The idea is that complex situations are often open to many different interpretations, especially because those complex situations will have more information that might be included, not included in whatever presentation you are giving about that issue. And so here in this image now, this could be interpreted in multiple ways. People could think of it as a duck chasing a bunny. It could be two ducks facing each other arguing. It could be two mad bunnies looking away from each other. And so the situation itself could be open to a lot of interpretations because of its potential complexity. And that brings us to our overall main point, that how we are describing, naming, and unpacking that situation or issue for our audience influences how they're going to understand it and act towards it. And so think of just that basic image. If you are seeing a bunny, you are going to act towards that bunny in a different way than you would act towards a duck. You would bring the bunny the carrot and you'd bring the duck a piece of bread. And so how you name it encourages you to think about the situation differently and how you should act in that situation differently. But a speaker or an advocate might want to change the audience's perception about a particular issue or situation. And if they do so, they can offer a reframe. They can reframe the situation by providing a new coherent way of thinking about that situation or an issue. And so let's think about that image. If you just look at that image, you might be thinking it's kind of a weird image of a man wearing a hat. But a skilled speaker or advocate could come along and explain to the audience how they could see that differently. That speaker or advocate could reframe the situation and encourage us to look at it differently. And in this case, let's flip the image upside down, and now we see a dog with a bone as opposed to a man with a hat. And then importantly, we're going to act differently towards a dog with a bone than we are the man with the hat. Now, maybe a real world example would be useful. So let's look at the real world issue of obesity in the United States. Now, there are many ways we could talk about obesity, but there are kind of two dominant ones I want to talk about. And the first main one, probably the most common one, is that obesity is defined as a personal issue as a result of lack of good diet and not exercising enough. And if you define and think about obesity in that manner, you set yourself up for a particular solution. And so you set up a solution such as individuals need to eat more healthy and exercise more. But that solution would be different if you think of the problem in a different way. Another way we could define and frame the issue of obesity would be to define it in a structural manner and to say that obesity is caused by things like lack of access to cheap and healthy foods in certain areas of the United States, and then a decline in physical education. And so this frame doesn't just place blame on the individual for obesity, but says that there are a lot of factors that are causing people to become more obese that also need to be addressed. And then that sets us up for a different kind of solution. So when we define the problem in a structural way, we have more of a structural solution that we need to be increasing subsidies for child nutrition. We need to make sure that there's healthy food options in cafeterias at school. And we'd also want to make sure that there's support for physical education programs and like after school sports and those kinds of things to make sure people have the opportunity then to make good choices in terms of their eating habits and their exercise. And now that we know a little bit more about what frames are and how they work to influence people, we can move to the next step, which is actually learning how can we analyze a frame and understand how that frame is encouraging us to think or act. And so we have frame analysis, and this is our tool that we can use to analyze those frames. When we're analyzing frames, we're asking some basic questions. And so as we go through them, let's imagine that we are analyzing kind of the news coverage of a natural disaster. So one of the first questions that we ask is, what is the text's vantage point? If we're thinking back to that mountain, where is the person standing as they are taking the picture? And so for our example about news reports about a natural disaster, is it a local reporter who's giving us the news who is actually experiencing the natural disaster as well? Is it somebody from a national news network like CNN or Fox News or MSNBC who isn't there and maybe isn't personally experiencing the issue? The next question we can ask is, what is included or excluded from the description or the frame of that issue or situation? So for example, let's think about an issue like the minimum wage. There's lots of different information out there about the potential benefits and downsides of increasing the minimum wage. And so when someone's discussing that topic, we can ask, what are the information that they are including in the discussion, and what's the information that they're not including in the discussion? If we think about a national broadcast about this natural disaster, that national broadcast might include a lot of different information. It might include discussions of climate change as it relates to what's going on. It might include information about whether or not Congress just cut FEMA or increased FEMA's budget. And so as the national broadcast is describing this particular situation, it is encouraging us to start thinking about it a little differently. If they mention climate change, that might even encourage us who are nowhere near that natural disaster to start doing something as it relates to climate change. And no matter where you are, if they're talking about whether or not Congress increased or decreased FEMA's budget, that might encourage us to be happy about what Congress has done or be angry at Congress. And so we're going to act differently towards Congress. And then we have a related question about what is being emphasized or downplayed. Now, the difference is once we figure out what's being included or excluded, the actual things that are included might be talked about in different ways. They might spend a lot more time talking about, for example, FEMA's budget than they do climate change, but they include discussions of both. And a local anchor might actually mention climate change, but only mention it in passing and really downplay that component about climate change while emphasizing the information about evacuation routes, where people can get help, all of those things. And the final thing that we can think about is, how is this description or story structured? How does it naturally progress or want to progress? And so for this, let's go back to the idea of obesity. And so if we start a description of obesity as it's an individual problem, that naturally progresses then into solutions that are focused on individuals. And so if we think about the natural disaster as just what Mother Nature does, that encourages us to respond to it in a different way than if we define that natural disaster as a result of human-caused climate change. When we have the more natural frame, it encourages us maybe not to do anything or just be prepared. When we have that climate change emphasis in the narrative or the description, then we have more of an inclination to, as people, do something about the broader issue. And after we answer those questions for ourselves, we can move on to the next stage, which is evaluating it. What those questions do is give us a thick description of what is going on in this frame, in this way the issue or situation is being defined. Now we need to ask, is this helpful in terms of how it is persuading the audience, or is the frame not helpful in terms of how the text wants to persuade the audience? To do this, we can ask questions like, how well does the way the problem is being described or framed line up with the solution that's being proposed? And so let's take the issue of childhood hunger, for example. If someone is giving a speech about this issue and describes it as a huge issue, a massive systematic issue where a lot of children are not able to get the nutrition and the food that they need. If the proposed solution to that is have one individual do something, then that's not going to add up for the audience, and the way the overall issue has been framed does not progress well and will be left unsatisfied of the solution being proposed. We can also ask things like, how well does this frame encourage the audience to get engaged and active in the issue? So if we go back to a climate change example, if there is a lot of the frame that is talking about natural causes, natural issues that lead to particular disasters, that might minimize the idea that climate change is human caused, and thus minimize the audience thinking they need to get engaged with the issue. From there, we can step back and ask a broader question about, how well does this frame being offered by the rhetor, the advocate, the speaker, actually help us address the situation? And so let's go back to our obesity example for a moment. Let's imagine that we're analyzing discourse around obesity, and we notice that all of the discourse around obesity is that individual frame, that obesity is the result of poor eating habits and lack of exercise. And let's further imagine that this discourse about obesity has nothing about that structural or systematic frame that we talked about earlier, such as, are there food deserts here? Is there actually access to cheap, healthy food options? Is the food being offered in school good or not good for the students? Are people being taught physical education? And so from there, we might have an argument or make a conclusion that, hey, this frame maybe isn't serving us as well as it could be if it both included individual and structural aspects of this issue in the frame that's being used. And so in short, when we're doing this frame analysis, we have the first step, which is more description. How is this frame constructed? How is the rhetor framing the situation and encouraging us to act? And then we can ask more evaluative questions about how well the frame is working to influence people or shape how people see an issue or help us resolve a problem. And so that's our lesson on frames and frame analysis. I hope you learned something. Have a good one. See you next time.